The dust rose like smoke signals across the Mexican plateau, each cloud marking another regiment of General Antonio López de Santa Anna's massive army. As it advanced toward the narrow valley that locals called La Angostura, the narrow place, it was February 22, 1847, and the fate of two nations hung in the balance as 20,000 Mexican soldiers marched toward a handful of American defenders who refused to retreat. General Zachary Taylor, nicknamed Old, rough and ready by his troops, stood atop a rocky outcropping near the village of Buena Vista, his weathered hands gripping a spyglass as he studied the approaching Mexican columns. The sight should have filled him with dread. His force of roughly 5,000 men, mostly inexperienced volunteers, faced odds of nearly 4-to-1. Yet something in the geography of this place, 7 miles south of Saltillo in the state of Coahuila, gave him hope. The narrow valley channeled any attacking force into predictable corridors, and his artillery could command the key approaches behind Taylor. His officers exchanged nervous glances. Many of these men had never seen battle, recruited from the farms and towns of Kentucky, Illinois, Indiana, and Arkansas. They had signed up for adventure and glory, but now faced the most feared general in Mexico, the same Santa Anna who had crushed the defenders of the Alamo just 11 years earlier. The irony was not lost on the American commander. He was outnumbered almost exactly as badly as the Texan defenders had been, yet here he was, preparing to make his stand in another narrow place. The Mexican-American War had been raging for nearly 2 years, sparked by the American annexation of Texas and territorial disputes along the Rio Grande. President James Knox Polk had initially hoped for a quick victory that would secure California and the Southwest for the expanding United States. Instead, the conflict had become a grinding affair of sieges, marches through hostile territory, and battles that seemed to settle nothing permanently. According to historical analysis from the American History Central Archives, this battle would prove to be one of the war's most decisive encounters. Though neither commander fully understood its significance at the time, Taylor's situation was precarious. Most of his veteran troops had been transferred to General Winfield Scott's expedition against Veracruz, leaving him with what many considered the dregs of the American Army, volunteer regiments with minimal training and questionable discipline. His artillery, however, was different. Captain Braxton Bragg's battery and Major John Reynolds' guns were manned by professional soldiers who understood the deadly mathematics of cannon fire. These weapons would need to compensate for everything his infantry lacked. Santa Anna, meanwhile, had his own concerns despite his overwhelming numerical advantage. His army had marched north from San Luis Potosi in the middle of winter, covering nearly 300 miles through harsh desert terrain. Hundreds of soldiers had deserted along the way, and those who remained were exhausted, hungry, and suffering from the effects of the brutal march. The Mexican general knew that morale was fragile and that his force, while impressive on paper, included many untrained conscripts who might break under pressure. As the sun began to set on February 22nd, advance elements of the Mexican army took positions on the high ground south of the American lines. Both commanders spent the night making final preparations, knowing that dawn would bring a battle that would determine not just the immediate fate of their armies, but potentially the outcome of the entire war. The narrow valley of La Angostura would soon echo with the thunder of cannon and the cries of men fighting for their vision of North America's future. The morning of February 23rd, 1847, broke cold and clear over the valley of Buena Vista. A thin layer of frost covered the desert scrub, and the breath of both armies formed ghostly clouds in the crisp air. Santa Anna had positioned his forces during the night, with General Pedro de Amputia's division holding the center, while General Francisco Mejia commanded the right wing that would attempt to outflank the American left. The Mexican plan was elegant in its simplicity: overwhelm the Americans with superior numbers, while using the mobility of their cavalry to strike where the defenders were weakest. Taylor had deployed his forces with the careful precision of a man who understood that every position might mean the difference between victory and catastrophe. Colonel Jefferson Davis and his 1st Mississippi Rifles held the American left, supported by the 3rd Indiana Regiment under Colonel James Henry Lane. The center was anchored by Captain Thomas Washington Sherman's artillery battery, while the right wing consisted of various volunteer regiments positioned along the road to Saltillo. It was a thin line, stretched almost to the breaking point, but Taylor had positioned his reserves carefully and ensured that his artillery could support any threatened sector. The battle began at dawn with a massive Mexican assault on the American left wing. General Amputia's troops, many of them seasoned veterans from Santa Anna's campaigns, advanced in dense columns supported by cavalry and artillery. The sight was magnificent and terrifying, thousands of soldiers in blue and white uniforms moving across the valley floor like a great wave, their bayonets glinting in the morning sun and their battle flags streaming in the desert wind. The sound of their approach was equally impressive. The steady beat of drums, the blare of bugles, and the rhythmic tramp of boots on hard ground. The American volunteers on the left wing had never seen anything like it. Many of these men were farmers and shopkeepers who had joined up seeking adventure, and the reality of battle was far different from their romantic imaginings. As the Mexican columns drew closer, some of the inexperienced troops began to waver. A few companies from the 2nd Indiana Regiment actually broke and fled toward the rear, creating gaps in the American line that threatened to become fatal weaknesses. It was at this critical moment that the true character of the American commanders began to show. Colonel Davis, despite being weakened by illness and still suffering from a foot wound received at the Battle of Monterey, rallied his Mississippi troops with words that would be remembered for generations. "Stand fast, Mississippians," he shouted. Above the din of battle, "Show these volunteers how soldiers fight." His regiment, armed with the latest model rifle muskets, delivered devastating volleys that stopped the Mexican advance. In its tracks, Captain Braxton Bragg's artillery battery proved equally decisive. Positioned on a small rise that commanded the valley approaches, Bragg's 6-pound cannons began firing double charges of canister shot into the advancing Mexican columns. The effect was horrific. Each discharge sent hundreds of metal balls sifting through the packed ranks of infantry, leaving gaps that closed only to be torn open again by the next salvo. Years later, military historians would cite this engagement as a perfect example of how properly positioned artillery could multiply the effectiveness of a small defending force. The fighting continued throughout the morning with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. Mexican courage was unquestionable time and again. Their infantry reformed after devastating losses and renewed their attacks on the American positions. But the narrow valley that had seemed like such an advantage to Santa Anna was proving to be a trap. His superior numbers meant nothing when only a fraction of his forces could engage at any given time, while the American artillery commanded every approach route. As the sun climbed higher and the battle raged on, both commanders began to realize that this engagement would not be decided by a single dramatic charge or clever maneuver. Instead, it would be a test of endurance, courage, and the ability of leaders to inspire their men during the darkest moments of combat. The Battle of Buena Vista was becoming exactly the kind of grinding, costly affair that would define much of 19th century warfare. By midday on February 23rd, the Battle of Buena Vista had reached its most critical phase. The Mexican assault on the American left had been repulsed, but Santa Anna was far from finished. Drawing on his years of experience in Mexican civil wars and his knowledge of American weaknesses, the Mexican general ordered a coordinated attack on multiple points of the American line simultaneously. If he could stretch Taylor's already thin forces beyond their breaking point, the entire American position might collapse like a house of cards. The most dangerous threat emerged on the American right wing, where General Francisco Mejia led a combined force of cavalry and infantry round the eastern edge of the valley. This flanking movement, if successful, would cut the American line of retreat to Saltillo and potentially trap Taylor's entire army. In the narrow valley, the Mexican cavalry, magnificent horsemen mounted on hardy desert horses, swept across the plateau in a cloud of dust and steel that seemed to stretch from horizon to horizon. Condition of his own forces, the American volunteers, despite their ultimate victory, were in no condition to undertake a pursuit that might result in their own destruction. The aftermath of the Battle of Buena Vista provided both armies with sobering lessons about the nature of warfare in the mid-19th century. Mexican casualties were staggering. Official reports, though incomplete, suggested that Santa Anna's army had suffered more than 3,000 killed, wounded, and missing out of an initial strength of nearly 20,000 men. American losses, while much lighter in absolute numbers, represented a significant percentage of Taylor's small force, 267 killed, 456 wounded, and 23 missing. The strategic consequences of the battle extended far beyond the immediate tactical outcome. Santa Anna's defeat at Buena Vista effectively ended Mexican hopes of driving American forces out of northern Mexico. The psychological impact on both armies was equally significant. American volunteers had proven that citizen soldiers could stand against professional troops when properly led and positioned, while Mexican morale was shattered by the failure of their largest army to defeat a much smaller American force. Military historians have continued to study the Battle of Buena Vista for its lessons about artillery tactics, volunteer forces, and the importance of terrain in defensive operations. The battle demonstrated that properly positioned artillery could multiply the effectiveness of defending forces far beyond their numerical strength. Captain Braxton Bragg's battery alone was credited with breaking up multiple Mexican attacks, and the coordination between American artillery and infantry became a model for future military operations. The battle's impact on American military thinking was profound and long-lasting. The performance of volunteer regiments, like Davis's 1st Mississippi Rifles, challenged traditional assumptions about the superiority of professional armies and helped establish the American tradition of effective citizen soldiers. The tactical innovations demonstrated at Buena Vista, particularly the use of concentrated artillery fire and flexible defensive positions, would influence American military doctrine through the Civil War and beyond. Perhaps most significantly, the Battle of Buena Vista demonstrated the crucial importance of leadership at all levels during combat operations. From General Taylor's calm presence under fire to Captain Bragg's professional gunnery to Colonel Davis's innovative infantry tactics, the battle showed how individual leaders could influence the outcome of large-scale engagements. These lessons would prove invaluable when many of the same officers faced each other across Civil War battlefields. Just 15 years later, the battle's legacy extends beyond purely military considerations to encompass broader questions about American national character and the nature of democratic warfare. The volunteer soldiers who fought at Buena Vista were not professional warriors, but citizens who had temporarily taken up arms in service of their country. Their performance under extreme conditions suggested that democratic societies could produce effective military forces without relying on the professional armies that dominated European warfare. Today, more than 175 years after the guns fell silent in the valley of La Angostura, the Battle of Buena Vista continues to be studied in military academies around the world. Its lessons about leadership, tactical innovation, and the effective use of combined arms remain relevant to modern military professionals. The narrow valley where Zachary Taylor's volunteers stood against overwhelming odds has become a symbol of American military determination and a testament to the courage of soldiers on both sides who fought for their vision of North America's future. Colonel Archibald Yell's Arkansas Regiment found itself directly in the path of this Mexican cavalry charge. These volunteers, many of them frontiersmen and hunters from the Ozark Mountains, had never faced organized cavalry in battle. The sight of hundreds of Mexican lancers thundering toward them, their lance points glittering and their colorful uniforms bright against the desert landscape, was enough to break the nerve of even seasoned soldiers. Within minutes, most of Yell's regiment had scattered, leaving a gaping hole in the American right wing that threatened the entire position. General Taylor himself rode into the crisis, his presence immediately recognizable by his plain uniform and his habit of sitting sideways in his saddle. Despite being nearly 63 years old, Old Rough and Ready displayed the kind of personal courage that inspired legends. Riding directly toward the advancing Mexican cavalry, he began rallying the scattered Arkansas troops and directing reinforcements to plug the gap in his lines. His calm demeanor under fire became the stuff of military legend, with soldiers later recounting how he seemed utterly indifferent to the bullets and cannonballs flying around him. The situation was saved by the quick thinking of Captain John Paul Jones O'Brien, commanding a section of artillery that had been held in reserve, racing his guns to a position where they could enfilade the Mexican cavalry charge. O'Brien's cannoneers loaded with canister shot and waited until the enemy horsemen were at point-blank range before opening fire. The effect was devastating. Horses and riders went down in tangled heaps, and the magnificent cavalry charge dissolved into chaos and confusion. Meanwhile, on the American left, Jefferson Davis and his Mississippi Rifles were fighting for their lives against renewed Mexican infantry attacks. Santa Anna had committed his reserves to this sector, reasoning that if he could break through here, he could roll up the entire American line from left to right. The fighting became hand-to-hand in places, with Mexican soldiers climbing over their own dead to reach the American positions. Davis, despite his painful foot wound, moved constantly along his regiment's line, encouraging his men and directing their fire with the precision of a veteran soldier. The crisis reached its peak when a Mexican column actually penetrated the center of the American line, threatening to split Taylor's force in two. For several terrifying minutes, it appeared that the Battle of Buena Vista would end in complete American disaster. Mexican soldiers were fighting among the American artillery positions, and the sound of battle seemed to come from every direction. At once, some American units began to withdraw without orders, and the careful defensive positions that Taylor had established throughout the morning began to crumble under the pressure of simultaneous attacks. That it was at this moment that the true character of American volunteer soldiers began to emerge. These men might have lacked the formal training and parade ground precision of European armies, but they possessed something equally valuable, an individual initiative and stubborn courage that made them incredibly difficult to defeat. Small groups of soldiers, often led by junior officers or even private soldiers, began forming impromptu defensive positions wherever they found themselves. The battle became a series of separate engagements, each one critical to the overall outcome. As the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the valley of Buena Vista, the battle entered a new phase that would forever change how military historians viewed the role of artillery in warfare. Captain Braxton Bragg, whose battery had already proven decisive in repelling the morning's attacks, found himself at the center of the most critical moment of the entire engagement. With Mexican infantry advancing on multiple fronts and American volunteer regiments wavering under the pressure, everything depended on the deadly precision of the American cannons. Bragg's 6 guns had been repositioned 3 times during the course of the battle, each move calculated to maximize their effectiveness against the latest Mexican assault. His cannoneers, faces blackened with powder smoke and uniforms soaked with sweat, worked with the mechanical precision that came from years of drill and the desperate energy that comes from fighting for survival. Each cannon could fire approximately 2 rounds per minute when properly served, and at the ranges they were engaging, virtually every shot found its mark among the dense Mexican formations. The Mexican response to the devastating American artillery fire revealed both the courage of Santa Anna's soldiers and the tactical limitations of traditional 19th century assault tactics. Time and again, Mexican infantry regiments reformed their shattered ranks and renewed their attacks, displaying a heroism that earned the grudging respect of their American opponents. But courage alone could not overcome the mathematics of artillery fire. A single cannon firing canister shot could disable dozens of men with each discharge, and the Americans had concentrated their guns to create overlapping fields of fire that made approach extremely costly. General Taylor, observing the battle from various positions along his line, began to understand that he was witnessing something historically significant. The Battle of Buena Vista was demonstrating the dominance that properly handled artillery could achieve over infantry attacks, even when the infantry vastly outnumbered the defenders. This lesson would not be lost on military observers, and indeed, As noted in warfare history analyses, the tactical principles demonstrated at Buena Vista would influence American military thinking for decades to come. Santa Anna, recognizing that his frontal assaults were achieving nothing but casualties, attempted a different approach, drawing on his experience in numerous Mexican civil wars. He ordered his artillery forward to engage the American guns in a counter-battery duel. Mexican cannons, many of them captured British pieces from the Independence Wars, began to concentrate their fire on Bragg's positions. The sound was deafening, a continuous rolling thunder that could be heard for miles across the desert plateau. The artillery duel that followed became one of the most intense of the entire Mexican-American War. Gun crews on both sides worked feverishly to maintain their rate of fire, while under direct enemy bombardment, Mexican cannonballs crashed into American positions, sending up geysers of dirt and stone fragments that wounded men hundreds of yards away. American return fire was equally effective, dismounting Mexican guns and scattering their crews across the valley floor. It was during this phase of the battle that Captain Thomas Washington Sherman's battery joined the fight with devastating effect. Sherman, a professional soldier who would later become famous during the Civil War, had held his guns in reserve throughout the morning, waiting for the critical moment when their intervention might prove decisive. That moment came when Mexican infantry, taking advantage of the artillery duel, attempted to advance under cover of their own cannon fire. Sherman's battery, positioned to enfilade the Mexican advance, opened fire with precision that bordered on the surgical. Each round was carefully aimed and timed to achieve maximum effect against the advancing columns. The Mexican infantry, caught between the fire of multiple American batteries, found themselves in an impossible situation. To advance meant walking into a storm of canister shot, while to retreat meant exposing themselves to fire from different angles. The effectiveness of the American artillery at Buena Vista was enhanced by several factors that military historians continue to study today. The Mexican forces, accustomed to fighting civil wars where artillery was often poorly served and ammunition scarce, were unprepared for the professional gunnery they encountered. Additionally, the narrow valley concentrated the Mexican attacks into predictable corridors where American guns could achieve maximum effectiveness. Finally, the training and experience of the American artillery officers, most of whom were West Point graduates, proved superior to their Mexican counterparts in the crucial areas of range estimation, ammunition selection, and tactical positioning. As the Battle of Buena Vista entered its final phase, the true mettle of the American volunteer soldiers was put to its ultimate test. These citizen soldiers, many of whom had never fired a shot in anger before this campaign, found themselves facing not just the enemy's bullets, but their own fears and the natural human instinct to flee from danger. What happened next would become the stuff of American military legend and provide crucial insights into the nature of volunteer forces that military academies would study for generations. Colonel Jefferson Davis and his 1st Mississippi Rifles had already distinguished themselves during the morning fighting, but their greatest trial lay ahead. Santa Anna, desperate to achieve some decisive result from his costly attacks, ordered a final massive assault on the American left wing. This attack would involve the best troops remaining to the Mexican Army, veteran regiments that had fought in multiple campaigns and whose officers understood the importance of maintaining formation under fire. The clash between Davis's Mississippians and the advancing Mexican infantry became the climax of the entire battle. For nearly 30 minutes, the two forces stood at close range and exchanged volleys that decimated both sides. The American rifles, superior in range and accuracy to the Mexican muskets, took a terrible toll on the attacking force. But Mexican courage was equally impressive. Time and again, officers led their men forward despite horrific casualties, and the battle line swayed back and forth as advantage shifted from one side to the other. Captain Braxton Bragg's artillery played a crucial role in supporting the infantry engagement. His cannons, repositioned once again to support Davis's advance, fired over the heads of the American infantry to strike the rear ranks of the Mexican formation. This was extremely dangerous gunnery. A miscalculation could result in American artillery killing American infantry. But Bragg's gun crews had reached a level of precision that bordered on the miraculous, and their fire struck the Mexican reserves with devastating accuracy. The turning point came when Colonel Davis himself was wounded by a Mexican musket ball that struck him in the foot, reopening his old wound from Monterrey. Despite the pain and loss of blood, Davis refused to leave the field, instead using his sword as a crutch while continuing to direct his regiment's fire. His example inspired his men to extraordinary efforts, and their rate of fire increased to levels that amazed observers on both sides. The final moments of the Mexican assault were marked by acts of individual heroism that would be remembered long after the battle ended. Mexican officers, seeing their men beginning to waver under the concentrated American fire, led desperate charges that brought them within yards of the American lines. American soldiers, many of them fighting their first battle, stood their ground and delivered point-blank volleys that stopped these charges cold. The desert floor between the two armies became carpeted with casualties, testament to the courage displayed by both sides. When the Mexican attack finally broke and began to retreat, the American volunteers did not pursue. They were too exhausted, too shocked by what they had experienced, and too respectful of the enemy's courage to engage in a rout. Instead, they watched in silence as Santa Anna's soldiers withdrew across the valley, carrying their wounded and maintaining their formation even in defeat. As darkness began to fall on February 23, 1847, General Antonio López de Santa Anna faced the most difficult decision of his military career. His army had suffered enormous casualties throughout the day. Conservative estimates placed Mexican losses at over 3,000 killed, wounded, and missing. Compared to fewer than 800 American casualties, the narrow valley of Buena Vista was littered with evidence of the day's fighting, abandoned equipment, wounded soldiers from both armies, and the grim testimony of cannonballs embedded in the desert hardpan. Yet Santa Anna was not a man easily discouraged by setbacks. Throughout his tumultuous career, he had demonstrated a remarkable ability to snatch victory from apparent defeat, and his political survival in Mexico's chaotic political system had depended on his willingness to take enormous risks when conventional approaches failed. As he surveyed his battered but still formidable army, the Mexican general began to contemplate a night attack that might yet salvage success. From the day's disappointments, the tactical situation remained complex despite the day's heavy fighting. While the Americans had successfully repelled every Mexican assault, they had paid a significant price in ammunition and energy. Taylor's volunteer regiments, many of them fighting their first major battle, were exhausted and demoralized despite their ultimate success in holding their positions. The American commander had committed virtually all of his reserves during the day's fighting, leaving him with little flexibility to respond to unexpected threats. Santa Anna's senior officers were divided on the question of continuing the battle. General Pedro de Ampudia, whose division had borne the brunt of the fighting on the Mexican right, argued strongly for an immediate retreat. His regiments had been decimated by American artillery fire, and many of his surviving soldiers were in no condition to continue fighting. The long march from San Luis Potosi, combined with the day's heavy casualties, had reduced his effective strength to less than half of his paper strength. General Francisco Mejia, commanding the Mexican left wing, presented a different perspective. His forces had been less heavily engaged during the day's fighting, and he believed that a properly coordinated night attack might succeed. Where daylight assaults had failed, Mexican soldiers, he argued, were accustomed to irregular warfare and night operations from their experience in civil conflicts. The Americans, by contrast, were mostly volunteers with little experience in such tactics. The debate among the Mexican commanders reflected broader questions about 19th century warfare that would not be fully resolved until the American Civil War. Traditional European military thinking emphasized formal battles fought in daylight between organized formations. Night attacks were considered risky and generally ineffective because of the difficulty of maintaining unit cohesion in darkness. But the Mexican-American War was being fought under conditions that challenged many traditional assumptions. Santa Anna's decision to continue the battle was influenced by political as well as military considerations. the Mexican general understood that his political survival depended on achieving some dramatic success that would restore his prestige with the Mexican people and government. A retreat after suffering such heavy casualties would be difficult to explain, while a successful night attack might transform defeat into victory and restore his reputation. As Mexico's greatest military leader, the plan that Santa Anna developed called for a coordinated assault on multiple points of the American line, timed to begin in the early morning hours when American sentries would be least alert. Mexican cavalry would sweep around the American flanks to cut their line of retreat, while infantry columns would strike the center of Taylor's position. The attack would be supported by artillery fire designed to create confusion and prevent American commanders from coordinating their defense. General Taylor, meanwhile, was facing his own difficult decisions. His army had fought magnificently during the day, but he was acutely aware of their limitations. Most of his volunteers had exhausted their ammunition during the day's fighting, and resupply would be difficult in the darkness. His artillery, which had been decisive during the daylight hours, would be far less effective in a night engagement where targets would be difficult to identify and range estimation nearly impossible. The American commander's response to the threat of continued fighting revealed both his strengths and weaknesses as a military leader. Taylor was undoubtedly brave and inspirational, qualities that had served him well throughout the day's fighting. But he was also a conventional thinker who preferred straightforward approaches to complex problems. The possibility of a Mexican night attack presented tactical challenges that stretched his abilities as a commander. The pre-dawn hours of February 24, 1847, brought an unexpected silence to the valley of Buena Vista. American sentries, expecting renewed Mexican attacks, peered nervously into the darkness, listening for the sound of approaching footsteps or the jingle of cavalry equipment. But as the first pale light of dawn began to illuminate the desert landscape, an astonishing sight greeted their eyes. The Mexican army was gone. During the night, Santa Anna had made the agonizing decision to withdraw his forces from the battlefield. The Mexican general, despite his reputation for dramatic gestures and desperate gambles, was also a practical soldier who understood when continued fighting would serve no useful purpose. His army had suffered crippling losses during the previous day's fighting, and his remaining forces were in no condition to mount the kind of coordinated attack that might succeed against Taylor's defensive positions. The Mexican retreat was conducted with remarkable skill and organization, demonstrating the professional competence of Santa Anna's staff officers and the discipline of his surviving troops. Despite their exhaustion and heavy casualties, the Mexican regiments maintained their formation and carried their wounded with them as they began the long march back toward San Luis Potosi. It was a retreat, but it was the retreat of soldiers, not the flight of a broken army. General Taylor's reaction to discovering the Mexican withdrawal revealed much about his character. As a commander, rather than immediately pursuing the retreating enemy, he ordered his troops to tend to their wounded and secure the battlefield. This decision reflected both humanitarian concern for casualties on both sides and sound military judgment about the